Silas Hale sat at a long table surrounded by 30 guests when his wife turned to him with a calm, rehearsed expression. Her clients and vendors filled the room she had decorated herself, and Amy and Lawrence sat 2 chairs away. Leela's voice carried clearly across the table as she told him that if he had any dignity left, he could either get on his knees and beg her to stay married or walk out of her event. He drove the company pickup he kept spotless, wore pressed khakis, and moved through dinner parties with a quiet that other men often mistook for having nothing to say. Leela's friends had started calling him Background Silas years earlier, and she had stopped correcting them. She delivered the line from the head of the table with the composed satisfaction of a woman who had practiced the moment and was pleased with how it landed. She expected what she had always received from him in public: patience, deference, the steady performance of a man who understood his place. Instead, Silas set his napkin on the table, stood, and said, "I hope everyone enjoys their evening." Then he walked out through the front doors without looking back. The room fell into a deep, stunned silence, the kind that follows something irreversible. Hale Distribution Group held 14 freight and procurement contracts, 3 of them with federal agencies, supplying 60 to food service and catering businesses across the Richmond area. The company generated $0.8 million in annual revenue and had become the quiet center of his life long before he met Leela Simmons at an industry mixer. What she had never once thought to ask in all their years of marriage was whose name appeared on the commercial sublease for the short pump event space she had been renting, or why that name matched the one on the pickup truck in her driveway. She called before he reached the interstate. He did not answer. She called for more times in the next 11 minutes. He listened to every voicemail the following morning with the same focused attention. He gave anything that mattered, then set the phone down and opened his laptop to call his attorney. Evelyn Price. The distribution center on Dabney Road moved to a rhythm Silas knew by heart. A steady sequence of arrivals and departures began before dawn and did not settle until the last route cleared the dock. He had built the mornings deliberately, the way a man builds a foundation, starting with the load-bearing pieces and working outward. He walked the dock early every day, clipboard in hand, not because the system required it, but because he believed what you owned was only as sound as your willingness to stand inside it. He kept a handwritten routing ledger on his desk beside the digital system, a habit passed down from his grandfather, who had run a smaller freight operation out of a converted warehouse for more than 2 decades. The old man had believed that a man who could not read his own numbers by hand could be taken apart by anyone with access to software. Silas had kept the ledger through every system change and had never needed to explain it to anyone who understood what it represented. His grandfather used to say, "A man who moves things quietly moves everything." He had meant it about freight, about life, and about the quiet advantage that belongs to men the world underestimates. Hale Distribution had begun with 2 refrigerated trucks and a regional grocery contract Silas won on his 3rd attempt. The first 2 rejections had been filed away without bitterness because his grandfather had taught him the difference between a setback and a personal failure. Over time, the company grew more trucks than the first federal contract until the year he attended a Richmond food and beverage mixer and met a woman in a red dress who was trying to convince a hotel catering manager to use her services. He told her he worked in freight logistics. She said her business might need something like that. He said he might be able to help. They married at a historic estate outside the city. For the first years, it felt like 2 people who had each built something real coming together in a way that made both stronger. The shift did not announce itself. It simply accumulated a name, Damien. Damien from the culinary community. Damien, whose well-regarded restaurant on Carey Street began appearing in her sentences with the easy familiarity of something already established in private. A Thursday evening described as a vendor meeting that produced no vendor in her contact list. A phone call taken in the backyard on a weekday morning with the door pulled shut behind her. Silas filed the observations. He did not rush. His company's cloud backup system, which he had configured himself to archive the network across all locations, generated a weekly activity report that arrived in his personal email every Monday. He read it the way he read all operational data, steadily, without urgency, waiting for the pattern to appear. In the weeks leading up to the client event, the report showed that 23 documents had been downloaded from the shared business drive to an external device across 3 separate late-night sessions. He studied the list for a long moment, then opened his laptop and began pulling the access logs with the same deliberate calm he brought to every inventory he had ever conducted. The documents included Hale Distribution's quarterly financial statements for the prior 3 years, the federal contract renewal letters, and the company's current routing agreements with 62 clients. One file name stopped him. He read it twice. The signed service agreement between Hale Distribution Group and Simmons Catering LLC, the document that governed how his company supplied hers and at what rate. She had sent his business documents to someone he did not know. He ran the external IP address through his IT consultant, who returned within hours with a clear answer. The address resolved to a registered network belonging to a family law practice on West Broad Street. Leela had retained a divorce attorney. She had been building a file on his company for weeks. His hands did not shake. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined every important action. He pulled the service agreement she had downloaded and examined it the way he examined any document about to be used against him, not with alarm, but with professional attention. Then he ran the invoice history. For years of services rendered to Simmons Catering at the discounted internal rate totaled $218,000 billed, $124,000 paid, leaving a $94,000 balance sitting in accounts receivable as a deferred amount he had never pressed because she was his wife and he had not needed to. He pulled the company formation documents and found the item he had suspected would matter. Years earlier, before the marriage, Leela had loaned him $47,000, documented in a promissory note he had drafted himself. The bank records showed the repayment in full, transferred to her personal savings account well before the wedding. The note was marked satisfied. She had told her attorney she had invested $47,000 in his company. He sat with that for a moment, then went back through their shared calendar and found a recurring weekly entry that had been running for several weeks, labeled in a way that suggested regular meetings. The timing aligned with the start of the document downloads and the weeks leading up to the client event. She had been planning for months. He ran the commercial lease on the short pump venue. The building's master lease belonged to a property management subsidiary of Hale Distribution Group, registered years earlier, which sublet units to local businesses at market rate. Simmons Catering had been paying $840 per month for 4 consecutive years to a sublease administered by his own company. She had written more than $40,000 in checks to a business her husband owned and had never once connected the name on the invoice to the name on the truck in her driveway. He opened a new folder on his desktop and labeled it simply. Then he called Evelyn Price and told her he was ready. Evelyn Price had maintained her practice on Grove Avenue for 25 years. Her office reflected the priorities of someone who had long ago stopped needing to impress new clients and now focused only on results. She was sharp in the particular way of a woman who had been underestimated by opposing counsel often enough to have built a methodology around it. She reviewed the folder on a Wednesday morning without commentary until she reached the invoice summary. Then she looked up over her reading glasses with the expression of someone confirming a calculation she had already made. She claims a $47,000 equity stake in a company that repaired. She turned to the venue documentation. For years of sublease payments to your company's property management subsidiary, she held the event where she gave you a public ultimatum in a venue she had been renting from your own company. Evelyn allowed herself exactly one moment of something that was not quite satisfaction, but lived beside it. The sublease renewal is due soon. We address it at the appropriate time. She closed the folder. Your job is what it has always been. Move nothing visible. Change nothing. Let her believe the next weeks proceed exactly as she expects. He drove to his Uncle Walter's house in Chesterfield on a Sunday. Walter Hale was retired and had driven the first truck Silas ever put on the road, a leased refrigerator unit that ran warm in summer and that Walter had complained about for 2 full years before Silas could afford to replace it. He had been present from the first contract, the first time anyone had looked at Hale Distribution as something more than a regional operation. Walter listened without interrupting, turning his coffee mug slowly in both hands. When Silas finished, he was quiet for a moment. You know what your grandmother used to say, he said finally. Don't show everything on the truck. Some cargo doesn't need to be visible to be valuable. He looked at his nephew. She knew what you were going to build. She also knew there would be somebody who didn't look hard enough to understand what it was. He paused. Leela didn't look. No, Silas said. Walter said the name Damien Laurent with the flat tone of a man raising a different subject. His supplier account at a local distribution company is 2 months past due. The restaurant is struggling. He looked at Silas steadily. That man has been presenting himself as something he is not currently in a position to be. Silas had already looked. The picture was consistent. Evelyn's investigative contact had assembled the full financial profile on Damien Laurent's restaurant group within a week. One location on Carey Street, for years old, carrying significant supplier debt, a commercial lease nearing default, kitchen equipment financing delinquent for months. The restaurant looked successful from the outside. The outside was the only part. Succeeding. Evelyn had also identified the 2 anchor accounts in Leela's catering portfolio clients, whose business represented a substantial portion of her annual revenue, and confirmed what Silas had understood since both relationships began. They had originated through introductions he made through Hale Distribution's vendor network. He did not intend to use that information. It was simply part of the complete picture, and a complete picture was what the situation required. On a weekday evening, Leela called and asked if they could have dinner. She used the word reasonable twice in the same sentence, the word people use when an attorney has advised them to begin managing a situation. He said he thought that was a good idea. They met at a restaurant on Patterson Avenue. She was warm in the specific way of a woman who believed warmth was still a working tool. He listened to everything she said, answered every question, ate the food at the table they shared, and kept his face completely calm because that was the only face he had. She told him she hoped they could handle everything without it getting complicated. He said he hoped so too. He drove home, added the meeting to his notes, and went to bed. Careful people did not get taken apart. That was the whole of it. The mediation was set for a weekday morning at Evelyn's office on Grove Avenue, which he had chosen as the neutral site her attorney had accepted. When Silas arrived, Leela and her attorney were already in the conference room. Her attorney had a prepared binder. Leela carried the composed readiness of a woman who had been told her position was strong and had believed it. She looked at Silas when he sat down with the carefully neutral expression she had been practicing. He returned it without addition. Her attorney presented Leela's initial position, the marital home, spousal support at a specified monthly figure, and an equitable interest in Hale Distribution Group on the basis of her founding financial contribution and years of operational involvement as a business partner. Evelyn let him finish. Then she opened the folder. The first document was Hale Distribution Group's original formation filing with the Virginia State Corporation Commission. Sole proprietor Silas Marcus Hale. Converted to LLC years later. Sole member remaining Silas Marcus Hale. The formation date came well before the marriage certificate Evelyn placed beside it. The second document was the promissory note for $47,000, signed years earlier, with Leela listed as lender. The third was the repayment transfer confirmation, full amount marked satisfied, transferred to Leela's personal savings account well before the wedding. The $47,000 your client invested in Hale Distribution Group was a documented loan, Evelyn said. It was repaid in full before the marriage. The money is in your client's personal account where it has been for years. It is not an equity contribution. It is a closed obligation. She looked at the opposing attorney directly. We expect that repayment record was not among the materials your client provided to you. The attorney had gone very still. The fourth document was the invoice. Summary 4 years of services rendered by Hale Distribution to Simmons. Catering at the discounted internal rate. Outstanding balance $94,000. The counterclaim had been filed and attached. Leela looked at Silas. Something had moved in her expression. That was an internal arrangement, she said. It was a documented service agreement between two separate legal entities. Evelyn replied. Your client signed it? The services were rendered. The balance was not paid. We have filed accordingly. The fifth document was the federal contract summary 3 procurement agreements with federal agencies. Annual revenue from those contracts alone $1.4 million recurring, with renewal terms extending well into the future. Leela had not known about the federal contracts. Her expression moved through several careful adjustments and arrived at the specific look of a woman who had just understood the full dimensions of a room she had been standing in for years without ever examining the walls. The sixth document Evelyn placed at the center of the table was the sublease agreement for the short pump venue for years at $840 per month. Tenant Simmons Catering LLC. Master Lease Hale Distribution Group Property Management. Your client held a client appreciation event at this venue, Evelyn said. At that event, she asked my client to publicly beg for his marriage or leave. The venue she delivered that ultimatum and has been generating rental income for my client's company for 4 consecutive years. She paused. The sublease renewal is due soon. My client will not be extending it. The room held its silence. Leela's attorney leaned toward her and spoke in a low, precise voice. She listened. She did not respond. Leela looked across the table at Silas. The composure she had brought through the door had not broken, but it had become something thinner, carrying the weight of a woman who understood fully and completely that the ground she had been standing on had never once belonged to her. I built that business, she said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness was costing her something. You did. Silas said. He was not unkind about it. He was simply accurate. You built a catering company. You built it using my distribution infrastructure at below market rates, my vendor relationships for 2 of your largest accounts, and a venue your checks were paying to my company for 4 years. That is not nothing. But it is not a basis for claiming what I built before you knew my last name. He gathered his copies of the disclosure, placed them in his bag, and stood. You told me to beg or leave in a room I was paying for. I left. That was the right answer then. He picked up the bag. It is the right answer now. He walked out of the conference room, through the lobby, and into the Richmond morning. The company pickup waited in the lot. He drove toward Dabney Road with the particular clarity of a man who had moved everything that needed moving and had not lost a single piece dot in the months that followed. Hale Distribution restructured its service agreement with Simmons Catering to standard. Hale Distribution added another federal procurement contract in the spring, bringing annual federal revenue close to $2 million. The operations manager Silas had promoted internally took over daily routing supervision, which freed him for contract development and planning work, the place where the next decade of the company lived. A woman named Lydia came into his life through a colleague in the federal contracting space. They were introduced at a procurement conference he attended without any particular expectation. He returned with her number and the memory of a conversation that had run past the point where either of them was still tracking the time. She was a contract specialist with a federal agency organized, exact, and entirely without performance in the way she engaged with things. She asked questions that required him to actually think before answering, which was his preferred condition for any conversation worth having. On a crisp fall morning, with the Richmond sky doing the particular thing it does in autumn, going wide and pale gold and pressing the city into a quieter version of itself, Silas sat on the back porch of the Westover Hills bungalow he had renovated across the previous seasons. It was a 1940s house 3 blocks from the James River that he had purchased and worked on himself on weekends and evenings, laying the hardwood in the main room and rebuilding the kitchen cabinets from a plan he had drafted on the back of a routing sheet. He had done the work the way he did all work, without rushing, without skipping steps, starting with what was load-bearing and moving outward. He had his coffee and the morning's routing report on the porch table. The river 3 blocks away was something he could not see, but could feel the presence of something, large and steady and moving continuously forward. He had moved everything that mattered to where it needed to go. I hope you enjoyed that one. If it moved you, like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've already picked out 2 more I think you'll really like.